Welcome to part 2 of the video tutorial on adjustments for inventory in transfer pricing. What you see on the screen in front of you is where we ended video 1 on this topic, where we had adjusted the uncontrolled party distributor to reflect a distributor which had started out with 90 days of inventory as if it had only held 30 days of inventory to make it more similar to the controlled party, the tested party, which only holds 30 days of inventory. We went through the calculation and showed how it's done. Now let's talk about the two things that will move the size of the adjustment in a inventory adjustment. To start off with, it could be that the interest rates are going to change. The interest rates are here in this cell. If we change this rate and say we double it from 2% to 4%, right now the adjusted comparable has an operating margin of 6.2%. But let's double this number, change it to 4, and we find that now the operating margin of the comparable on an adjusted basis is dropped to 5.9%. And of course we could keep doing this. If it goes to 6%, now it's down to 5.5%. So the sensitivity of the inventory adjustment will increase as interest rates are rising and the time value of money is becoming much greater. Something to keep in mind. Let's change back to the 2% that we had originally, and we've got the operating margin back to the 6.2% that on an adjusted basis makes it comparable. The other issue that would affect this, of course, is the inventory policy. Right now we have this firm holding inventories of 462,500, and that equals, as you can see in the formula bar up above, their sales divided by 4. They're holding 1/4 of a year's worth of inventory. Let's suppose we were to change that and we said instead, let's suppose they only hold 60 days of inventory. I can do that by dividing this number by 6. And now their inventory level is exactly 60 days. So forget that 90 is there and call it 60. As you can see, the numbers are going to change because they have a smaller amount of inventories proportionately greater than what the tested party has. And if you notice over here, the operating margin, which had been 6.2, is now up to 6.3. If we actually made it identical to the tested party, and we said they hold 1 month's worth of inventories, or 1/12 of their annual sales, and make that change, you can see that the adjustments go to 0 and we have the identical numbers coming across. But let's go back to where we were originally, where we had this number being 90 days of inventory, and then ask the question, well, this is all very nice, but this is a very labor-intensive way to go about doing it. And I've done it this way so you can sort of see how it's done. Next I'm going to show you the formula that we use for calculating this, and we've embedded that formula in our software that we use regularly. You can see here on the upper right of your screen the formula that we're using in calculating the transfer pricing adjustment, the inventory adjustment for the transfer pricing. It may look complex, but it's really relatively simple. The very first term in this formula, and I'll just underline it here in a red highlighting so you can see what I'm talking about, is essentially the inventory to sales ratio for the tested party. This is the inverse of how we calculate the number of days inventory, essentially. So we're holding 1/12 of a year's sales in inventories, and that's the number there for that. Now, we're using sales as the denominator because we've been looking at the operating margin as the profit level indicator, and the base of the operating margin is, of course, sales. Now, from that ratio, which tells us the proportion of inventory to sales that the tested party has, we subtract the ratio for the comparable. So now we know proportionately how different they are. So those two terms are very similar, and we can end up with the proportion difference in the sales of inventory. But again, that's only dealing in a proportion, and we need to somehow quantify this. So once we know the difference between those two proportions, we're going to multiply it by the sales of the comparable. Now we've quantified the difference in proportionality of holding inventory to a number of the difference in that increased amount of inventory that the comparable is holding. We've made the implicit assumption that this inventory is adding value to the customer, so it's affecting the price. And it's going to impact the comp because the comparable is going to have to finance that inventory. And we, in our example, have used the number here, 2%, as an estimate of what that cost of financing would be. You calculate this equation, and it's going to equal this number right here of 6,167. As you can see, that's the same number we had up here when we did our calculation. Again, if we changed the interest rate to say make it 4% down here, we're going to see all of the numbers change, and we're going to get a much larger adjustment to be applied to the sales level of the tested party and a much lower operating margin on an after adjusted basis. Thank you and have a good day.